Greetings, everybody. My name is John Dudosky, and I'm the professor here at Regis College at the University of Toronto and the director of the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center for Practical Theology. This is the third annual Scarboro Mission Lecture at Regis College, and we are happy to welcome Professor Peter Phan from Georgetown University. We begin with the land acknowledgement, and I have asked our doctoral student, one of our doctoral students, Erica Sumi Lee, to read that. She is currently doing a dissertation on Professor Phan's Trinitarian pluralism. So, Erica?
Thank you, John. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.
The programming offered by the Monsignor John Mary Fraser Center for Practical Theology and the Scarboro Missions Chair of Interreligious Dialogue was made possible through the Scarboro Missions legacy. Scarboro Missions is a society of apostolic life of Canadian Catholics, priests, and laity, motivated by the Spirit and dedicated to the person, teaching, and missions of Jesus Christ as expressed in the words, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." The Scarboro Missions legacy seeks to further its ministry, working by providing financial assistance to deserving organizations with like-minded objectives. I would like to introduce our Associate Director of the Fraser Center, Sister Petite Lau, who is also a doctoral student at TST in Regis College. She does a wonderful job, and it's great to work with her. The other member of our team tonight, Ashley Tran, who is an MDiv student here at Regis College, and she is our tech expert. So we're grateful for all the work she's done with this Zoom prep and on our website. While we would prefer to meet face-to-face rather than through a glass darkly, in the interest of preserving some interaction, we invite you questions to be sent through the comments function on the Zoom. And we may not get to all of your questions, but Michael and I will be trying to collate some, and we'll try to get to some of them, a few questions at the end. So thank you for coming and for participating. I want to introduce the moderator for the session, Professor Michael Stober, who's also a member of our Fraser team here, is the inaugural appointee and current holder of the Scarboro Missions Chair in Interreligious Dialogue, established by an endowment of the Scarboro Mission Fathers in 2018 to Regis College. He specializes in comparative mystical traditions and with a specialty in Hindu-Christian dialogue and a plethora of publications along those lines. In 2019, he gave the inaugural lecture on Black Elk of this forum. That robust lecture was recently published in Theological Studies as Indigenous and Roman Catholic Canonizations of Nicholas Black Elk, Post-Colonial Issues and Implications of Black Elk Speaks. Those of you who desire a copy and do not have access can email Professor Stober directly through the Regis College website, and he can provide you with that. With that, I turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much. Welcome, Peter, panelists, and thank you especially to Petite and Ashley for their work in bringing this thing together. I'm just going to introduce the three speakers. I'm going to introduce them all now, and then we'll let Peter go ahead with his lecture, and then Henry will follow up with about a 10-minute response, and then Michelle will end it off with a 10-minute response. And we'll have a few questions at the end. So as John said, send in some chat questions, and we'll see if we can get a few going there. So to begin, Henry Shiu is the inaugural Shi Wu Day Professor in Chinese Buddhist Studies at Emmanuel College of Victoria University and the University of Toronto. He's recently appointed in 2019. No, he's been around Toronto for a while. So he's a relatively new colleague at TST, at least formally. I got to know him the last couple of years, especially because he's been working closely with my one of my doctoral students, Tai-Hoon Kim, who's interested in themes in Buddhist Christian dialogue, and Professor Shiu's helping us out in that context. Henry's area of research specialization lies in the theory of the Tathagata, or the Buddha nature, and he's also focused his studies on Mahayana Buddhism in India, China, and Tibet, particularly in the historical and doctrinal development of the Madhyamaka and the Yogacara traditions. Other research interests of Henry include contemporary Buddhist movements, Buddhist chaplaincy, Buddhism in Canada, and Western classical music. Henry's published over 25 articles and chapters in both English and Chinese, and he's organized a number of conferences on these various themes of Buddhism. He's also an associate editor for International Journal of Buddhism and Psychology, and he's co-editor-in-chief of a monograph series in Sino-Tibetan Buddhist Studies. Thanks and welcome, Henry. Looking forward to your response. Michelle Voss Roberts is one of those academics who seems able to do everything: administration, editorial work, creative scholarship, gracious colleague. She accomplishes so much, seemingly effortlessly. She's always so calm and relaxed. She might be the most tranquil administrator I have ever met. She's the 13th principal and professor of theology at Emmanuel College of Victoria University and the University of Toronto, coming from Wake Forest University School of Divinity in 2018. She hasn't been here that long, but she's definitely made a statement for herself here at TST, where in Wake Forest, she was professor of theology and associate dean of academic affairs. She teaches in the fields of comparative and intersectional feminist theologies. I've known Michelle, especially from her work in the Society of Hindu Christian Studies, where she has served at all levels of the board, most recently as president, 2017 and 18. In her distinguished academic career, Michelle has received numerous research awards and published some 40 articles and book chapters, and authored 3 book-length works in comparative theology, one of which received the 2016 Award for Excellence from the American Academy of Religion, called Tastes of the Divine, Hindu and Christian Theologies of Emotion, which was published by Fordham University Press. Also, most recently, just the last couple of weeks, this has come out, she co-edited a substantial volume, the Routledge Handbook of Hindu-Christian Relations, which is being very well received. So, so pleased to have Michelle on our panel. Welcome. Finally, our speaker, Peter Phan. Since 1992, I've known him since 1992. We were colleagues at the Catholic University of America. He in the theology department. He was chair there, I think, when I arrived, or shortly thereafter. And I was in the Department of Religion and Religious Education. Peter was very friendly to me and gracious as a Canadian trying to settle down and find my way around Washington, D.C. So we would chat quite often in the hallways of Caldwell Hall, and he helped me to navigate the politics of Catholic University of America. He was always a supportive and gracious colleague towards me, and he was quite interested in some of the comparative work I was doing at the time. So I'm so pleased to be able to welcome here tonight to do the Fraser lecture for us. After 15 years at Catholic University, Peter moved across the city to Georgetown University, I think around 2004, where he became the inaugural holder of the Ignacio Ellacuria Chair of Catholic Social Thought. He's also founding director of the Graduate Studies program in Theology and Religious Studies. His research deals with the theology of icon and orthodox theology, patristic theology, eschatology, the history of Christian missions in Asia, and liberation, enculturation, and interreligious dialogue. He's the author and editor of over 30 books and has published over 300 essays. I'll only mention 3 of his books now, since they relate to the theme of his lecture today. He refers to them as a trilogy on Asian theologies. They're all published in the early 2000s. The first, Christianity with an Asian Face, Asian American Theology on the Making. This focuses on dialogue with Asian people, especially the poor, published in 2003. The second is titled In Our Own Tongues, Perspectives from Asia on Mission and Enculturation, published the following year in 2003, which focuses on dialogue with Asian cultures, enculturation, focus with Asian cultures. And lastly, perhaps one of his most significant books, Being Religious Interreligiously, Asian Perspectives on Interfaith Dialogue, published in 2004, focuses on interreligious dialogue. Again, his lecture today is on all of these themes in this context, so very appropriate in that context. His writings, Peter's writings, have been translated into 13 languages, including Chinese, Indonesian, Japanese, and Vietnamese. He's received many awards from learned societies. He's the first non-Anglo to be elected president of the Catholic Theological Society of America and the first president of American Theological Society. In 2010, he received the John Courtney Murray Award, the highest honor bestowed by the Catholic Theological Society of America for outstanding achievement in theology. He has 3 doctorates, one in divinity, one in philosophy, one in theology. And he's also been awarded 4 honorary doctorates. Despite all of these substantial accomplishments, Peter has referred to himself as an accidental theologian. He writes, quote, had South Vietnam not been defeated by the North, and had I not been fortuitously brought to the United States as a refugee in the 1970s, I would have earned my daily rice by non-academic jobs in my native country and would have blissfully remained a theological ignoramus. But divine providence has planned otherwise, and along with opportunities came responsibilities. I have tried to discharge these theological responsibilities by building bridges between East and West, and I am sure Asian theologians of the next generation will construct better ones between the 2 cultures, end quote. Today, Professor Phan is presenting an Asian integral ecological theology, Pope Francis teaching in dialogue with Asian religions. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Fraser Center for allowing me to come and speak with you. I also thank especially Michael Stober and John Dadowski, who have been my friends for a long time. I also thank the 2 respondents who have taken the time to read the little thing that I wrote. So thank you in advance. I'd like to stay within the 40 minutes and given to me. And so not everything I have written in the text will be talked about. Sometimes I summarize it, sometimes I expanded it, but that's the purpose, okay? So the topic of environmental and ecological degradation is as part of a cluster of economic and social problems was listed among the 6 most serious threats to global security and peace in the 21st century by the United Nations High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenges, and Change in 2005. Now, why ecological degradation? through the depletion of natural resources, the destruction of ecosystems, habitat, and wildlife, and the pollution of air and water, has long been studied as a scientific problem. Only recently has it been investigated from the cultural, anthropological, and religious perspectives. Furthermore, it has been recognized that ecological destruction, though a direct result of globalization of what is called the technocratic paradigm, has deep roots in modern anthropocentrism. Consequently, the solution to ecological degradation must not be limited to science, technology, politics, and economics, essential though these disciplines are, but must also be based on social, cultural, and religious convictions and values. Only in this way can an integral ecology, to cite the expression of Pope Francis, integral ecology, to borrow a phrase from Pope Francis, may emerge and provide an adequate solution to the ecological problem. Now, given the religious nature of the ecological crisis, it comes as no surprise that religious leaders of all different traditions have drawn from their own resources to contribute to the solution. Among these, the pride of place should be given to Pope Francis, whose first papal encyclical is Laudato Si, on care of our common home. I have it just in case you have it. It's a very interesting document, devoted exclusively to the issue of ecology. So this is the first papal writing that devoted to the topic of ecology as such. In a sense, Laudato Si encapsulates the twin foci of Francis' pontificate, which are implicit in his choice of the name Francis. 3 days after his election to the papacy on March 13, 2013, he explained the reason of his choice. And I quote, "Francis was a man of poverty who loved and protection creation." So poverty and creation. Protection of the environment and love of the poor are the two basic themes of the encyclical, and they are strictly intertwined since, as the Pope insists, it is the poor who suffer the most from ecological destruction. I quote, "The deterioration of the environment and society affects the most vulnerable people on the planet," unquote. The encyclical is an urgent, glaring call to the whole world to heed the cry of the poor and the cry of the devastated Mother, Sister Earth, that in Francis' arresting description, I quote, "is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth," number 21. Now, in addition to Laudato Si, Pope Francis also published a smaller, shorter encyclical, Querida Amazonia. It's a shorter, much shorter. And this is a post-synodal exhortation after the meeting of the Bishop of the Pan-Amazonia in Rome in 2019. Now, even though the Amazonian Synod and Querida Amazonia deals specifically with the Amazonian region, the issues under discussion, especially ecology, affect many other, especially poor parts of the globe, so that Pope Francis addresses this text not only to the Amazonians, not only to the Catholics, the Christians, but as he said it, to the whole world, the people of goodwill. Now, my purpose today is not to summarize and evaluate Pope Francis' two writings, which is unnecessary, as there is already a good number of studies, both popular and academic, that offer summary and critical analysis of them. You can get free copies of it on the internet. You just go type the name of the title and you can get free copies in PDF format. Rather, my task is to read Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia with Asian eyes, as it were, from the Asian perspective. And this I would do by raising 3 questions. So my lecture has about 3 parts. The first is this: which ideas of Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia would hold the greatest interest and thus are most relevant to Asians? So if you read the text as an Asian, what are the things that you pick out immediately that's most relevant to you? Second, are there any aspects of their teaching that would be enriched by incorporating the teachings of the Asian Catholic Church and, above all, the insights of the philosophical and religious traditions of Asia? So the second part is a sort of comparative theology that I'm doing, which my respondent, Michelle, is an expert in that. And the third question is, what are the most urgent remaining ecological issues that still need to be addressed? So that's it. So let's begin the first part, reading Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia in Asia. In a broad sense, Pope Francis' 2 writings are concerned to the people of Asia, since he addresses them not only to Catholics and other Christians, but also to the whole humanity, since, quote, the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all, unquote. And since all of us can cooperate as instruments of God for the care of creation, each according to his or her own culture, experience, involvements, and talents. But there is a special sense in which the people of Asia will find Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia to be of particular relevance for them in the light of both Francis' teaching on environmental protection and the current ecological situation of Asia. Now, it is very interesting to know that in Asia, there is no leading politician or prominent business leader who would deny the reality of climate change and ecological destruction, as we have, for example, in the United States. In the United States, the people still denying it. All it takes for them to dispel any thought of climate change as a scientific and political hoax is to step outside their offices into the street in any Asian metropolises, and they would be choked by smoke-filled air, assaulted by acrid smell, overwhelmed by wilting heat, and contaminated by disease-bearing water. So this is the situation almost in every country of Asia. You go to India, to China, to Vietnam, and many others. This is simply a daily threat. It's not simply an abstract discussion. It is affect their lives. In addition to this daily and constant threat to physical health caused by environmental degradation, many Asian countries such as India, Nepal, Bangladesh, China, Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Indonesia, many of which with coastal cities, are regularly ravaged by natural disasters. These have occurred with increasing frequency and wrought greater havoc, in particular floods, typhoons, hurricanes, torrential and prolonged rains, storms, heat waves, fires, and drought. If you just follow every year, you have these Asian countries affected by this natural disaster. Among the many effects of these weather-related disasters is forced migration. It is well documented that people in poorer countries are at least 4 times more likely to be uprooted from their lands and displaced by extreme weather than people in rich countries. In calling for environmental protection, Pope Francis strikes a sympathetic chord with the Asian people, given the fact that Asia is no doubt the continent most vulnerable to ecological degradation. You know the story, how they export these terrible industries to Asia, all those because in the West, there's so strict regulation on the environment. So they set it out to all the poorer countries, to Vietnam, the Philippines, and many other countries. They will find Pope Francis' teaching on ecology in Laudato Si very helpful. In particular, the scientific information he provides on global warming in chapter 1, on his discussion of the human roots of the ecological crisis in chapter 3, his message about integral ecology, chapter 4, and his call for ecological conversion and ecological education and spirituality in chapter 6. Those chapters are so wonderful and written in very clear language. By presenting a scientifically accurate and yet highly accessible explanation of how climate change results from human activities, Laudato Si makes a great contribution, normally not expected of a religious document, to the diffusion of the much needed understanding of the causal connection between the release of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, and others, the rise, the melt, the depletion of the ozone layer, global warming, the melting of the polar ice, the rise of the sea level on the one hand, all these things on the one hand, and human activities such as the burning of fossil fuel, coal, petroleum, and gas, deforestation, the dumping of industrial and nuclear waste and chemical products, and the increasing use of fertilizers, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, and agrotoxins on the other. So the causal connection, it's what the encyclical pointed out, focus on. Unless this causal connection between global warming and human activities is clearly understood and acknowledged, communal efforts to resolve the tragic effects of environmental degradation on the lives of the world's poorest in the new and universal solidarity would be not possible. And the temptation of many of us in Asia is to think of it, these natural disasters as God's act of punishment, literally. God acts of punishment, instead of seeing the connection between these things and human activities. And talking about Catholics, particularly in this case, the Catholics who are not possible, who are not able to get all the information on global warming and climate change, when they read that this is what the Pope says about it, and for them, the Pope is the highest teaching authority, they really accept this teaching rather than through reading scientific books and journals. Thanks to Pope Francis' clear call to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, we are now encouraged to pay attention to the catastrophic impact of global warming and climate change on the Asian poor in 3 areas. Habitable land, so land that can be lived on, access to healthy water, water is more precious than oil, and biodiversity. Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia, though not specifically written for Asia, are highly relevant for Asia. As Laudato Si argues, not only has, quote, the environmental, economic, and social ecology been degraded, but also the cultural ecology and the ecology of daily life have been seriously harmed. These 3 ecologies constitute what Laudato Si and Querida Amazonia call integral ecology that must be preserved through a worldwide and concerted effort in chapter 4. To achieve an integral ecology, Pope Francis says that it's not sufficient to fine-tune technical questions or political, juridical, social decisions. Let's tinker with that, not enough. A new educational system and the development of new habits in individuals and groups are required. Sadly, the Pope notes, consumerism and a culture of waste, typical of large cities, are already deeply rooted in the Amazon region, and we must add in Asia as well. He says, I quote, a sound and sustainable ecology incapable of bringing about change will develop unless people are changed, unless they are encouraged to opt for another style of life, one less greedy and more serene, more respectful, less anxious, and more fraternal. Querida Amazonia, number 58. So that's the first part of my presentation of what Pope Francis says about the environmental degradation and the idea of an integral ecology that is not only in terms of politics and science and so forth, but also in terms of religious ideas. My second part is to go over to connect, to kind of relate, build a bridge between the teaching of Pope Francis and the teaching of the Asian bishops, and above all, the teachings of different religious traditions in Asia. This section I will shorten very quickly and to say simply this, that the Asian bishops get together and call the Federation of Asian Bishop Conferences, FABC. FABC have been concerned with the question of ecology already in 1988. It was already a major issue for the Asian bishops. And interestingly, for the first time that the Pope, when he writes encyclical, he cites the conferences of bishops, national conference. Before that, no paper encyclical would cite the writings, the teachings of other conferences. And Pope Francis was the one who introduced this new idea that the magisterium is not simply a Roman magisterium, but the magisterium also of the bishops of different continents and countries. Now, there is one text that I would encourage you to read. There are many, but one is the letter of the conference bishop of Japan, and this is the title is Reference for Life, a message for the 21st century from the Catholic Bishop of Japan. It was issued in 2001 in a new edition. So if you're interested in what the Asian bishop talks about ecology, that would be the letter I would strongly urge you to read. Now, for the idea, the major idea of the Asian bishops on the notion on the climate change is the notion of harmony. It's so central, it's the central concept. In fact, the bishop issues documents called Asian Christian Perspective on Harmony, 70 pages long. You never see that. And the idea is that human life must be led in harmony, universal communion. And this is a fourfold. Me with God, certainly, is the first one. The second is with others, with my neighbors, people around me, and the harmony within myself, and the harmony with the cosmos. These are the fourfold aspects of the ecological protection that you have. I don't know. Okay. So I will not speak of that. I would like to move on right now to the idea of a kind of comparative theology in dialogue. What can we Christians learn from Buddhism and Taoism on the ecology Before I begin, I'd like to mention a series of books that has been published out of the Harvard Center of the World for the Study of World Religions. In 1996 to 1998, for 2 years, they held a lot of conferences, and the topic is ecology, and the other is different religions. So Confucianism they have, Christianity they have, Buddhism they have, Taoism they have, and indigenous religions. It's about 6 volumes. Each of them is about 500 to 600 pages long. So I would strongly recommend you, if you're interested in Buddhism and ecology, this is the volume, or Buddhism and Taoism, this is the volume. And the same thing with Christianity and indigenous religion. So it's some major works that I would recommend it. Now, here I would like to extend Francis' reflection on universal communion by invoking the Buddhist and Taoist perspectives. Admittedly, Pope Francis' belief in a personal God and in God's creative act is fundamentally different from the non-theistic and non-creationist stance of Buddhism and Taoism. So I don't want to say somehow you can make an easy comparison. And the comparison is hard because of very different tradition. One is theistic, one is a non-theistic. One is creationist, the other is non-creationist. Yet, in spite of the differences, these two Asian religious traditions offer insights into reality that strengthen and enlarge the Pope's position. In brief, the technocratic paradigm, which Pope Francis speaks at great length in Laudato Si, can be countered by the Buddhist notion of interdependent co-origination. And the excessive anthropocentrism, also the encyclical speak at great length about what we call excessive anthropocentrism, the idea that the world, the animals, and the matter, the trees and the plants, are valuable only in the extent that they can satisfy the needs and the wants of human beings. The idea that they have no value in themselves, intrinsic ontological value, their values only they can serve human needs. And the Pope called it excessive anthropocentrism. Now, I argue that this excessive anthropocentrism can be countered by the Taoist view of universal harmony. So let's go quickly to that. The first is the Buddhist wisdom. What can we learn from the Buddhist wisdom on ecology? And it can extend the idea of Pope Francis. There has recently been significant production of scholarship, both general handbooks and specialized monographs on Buddhism and ecology, as well as a proliferation of Buddhist social, political, and spiritual associations of environmental activism. So the book I just recommend you, that's one. This interest in ecological thought and practice in Buddhism has been dubbed the greening of Buddhism. In her helpful overview of the history and development of this movement, Stephanie Kaza, K-A-Z-A, Kaza, acknowledges that, quote, Buddhist environmental thought is both ancient and brand new. Buddhist ecological thought is ancient because it is rooted in the fundamental teachings of the earliest tradition of Buddhism, though, of course, these teachings need to be reinterpreted to meet the threat of the environmental destruction. In Theravada Buddhism, for instance, there is the central notion that suffering, dukkha, something wrong, something not right, is caused by the desire and attachment to things, tangha, born out of the ignorance of the impermanence of all beings. And therefore, the suffering is this attachment to things that we think is permanent, which is not. There's a fundamental ignorance, the error in understanding reality. And therefore, the suffering that can be overcome only with the compassion, karunya, and loving kindness, metta, which is extended, the compassion and the kindness is extended not only to human beings, but also to all animals, plants, and even natural elements. I'm sure Professor Henry Shi will have a lot to teach us on this point later. The Noble Eightfold Path, which is the core of Buddhist practice, which is intended as a guide for individual to achieve enlightenment and liberation from suffering, arriving at nirvana, is interpreted as ways to prevent and relieve the suffering and destruction of not just human beings, but also of the entire physical environment. In particular, the precept that included the first four paths, namely the right view, the right speech, the right action, and the right livelihood, have been reformulated by the Buddhist, ecological Buddhists, to promote the protection of the environment. A right view, right understanding, implies not only the correct understanding of the impermanence of things and the connection between ignorance of this essential nature of things and suffering, but also a correct understanding of the causal relations between certain human activities and climate change. So the right understanding is now expanded to include this understanding as well. Right speech prescribes not only telling lies, but also misleading advertising to promote ecological destructive consumerism. So this is, the lies is not simply not telling the truth, like we have now in the United States, terrible problem, but also the advertising that present things in order to be consumed, just consumerism. The right action include not only taking life, but also not killing human life, but also not doing harm to all living beings and things. Ahimsa, no doing harm. Right livelihood commands avoidance, not only killing life, profession, like being a soldier or a butcher or something like that, but also the acquisition of unnecessary things. The remaining four paths, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and right resolve, can also be interpreted in a way that is conducive to ecological responsible living, insofar as they train the individual mind to gain true insight into the nature reality of suffering as impermanent and interdependent. Now, the impermanence and interdependence of all things on one another bring us to the ecological thought present in Mahayana Buddhism. Central to this tradition is the concept of interdependent arising or origination, by which is meant that all things, all realities, do not exist as independent and permanent realities or selves, but are constantly changing and co-arising, emerging together, co-arising dependently on other things, so that there is a mutual arising between one thing and another thing, and this other thing also arises depend on other things. So you have this kind of universal codependence on arising. Now, the Buddhists express this in a very terse formula, which I really, really like. I quote to you. When this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases. This is no more powerful expression of this notion of interdependent co-arising in all human reality. Now, this doctrine is also expressed by the concept of emptiness, shunyata, or no self, anatman, which maintains that no self is independent of other selves. The Indian Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna pointed out that to say a thing is empty is to say that it is dependently originated, marked by three characteristics, namely transient, unsatisfactory, and without inherent, independent, inherent, substantial existence. Another representation of this Mahayana concept of the interdependence of all things is the beautiful jewel net of Indra. If you go on the internet, you type in the jewel net of Indra, you can see all the jewels reflect each other in a universal, and everyone reflected everything else. It's just a wonderful artistic representation. Now, in terms of ecological thought, the Buddhist concept of interdependent origination implicitly rejects the technocratic paradigm. This is my claim, that is, reject this technocratic paradigm, which views the world in terms of subject, object for domination and exploitation. In the interdependent origination affirms universal and mutual condition of all things. There is no subject and object. No being can exist without the other. One person without all the other persons, humanity without ecology, and ecology without humanity are all impossible. Now, I like to refer to one Vietnamese Buddhist, very famous, Thich Nhat Hanh. He was known in the United States for the anti-war movement and so forth. But one time he was giving a lecture, and he picked up the sheet of paper. There were about 5,000 people attending the lecture, and he weighed the piece of paper and asked them, "What do you see in this paper?" Well, the people say, "That's a piece of paper." But then Thich Nhat Hanh goes on to say, "But in this paper, there is also water. Without water, the tree cannot grow, and out of which you make paper. And then what else? Air. Without air, you can't do it. The tree cannot live." And they said, "What else? Fire. The sun." And so by waving this paper in front of the audience, he gave them a sense of interdependent co-origination. One kind cannot without the other. I read you just one text. If we look into this sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not here, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. We cannot grow up with sunshine, vitamin D. And so if we know that the sunshine is also in this sheet of paper, the paper and the sunshine inter-are. He invented this word, he coined this word, inter-being. So they inter-are. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we can see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread. And therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we see that without all of these things, the sheet of paper cannot exist. It's a powerful metaphor for us to understand this. And so he introduced the notion of inter-are. So this is the notion that is so helpful to understand Pope Francis talk about universal communion. So we can really, both sides can learn from this, saying universal communion, the fourfold universal harmony with God, with others, with the world, with myself. And it is this teaching. Now, despite profound resonances between Buddhist basic teachings, both in Theravada and Mahayana traditions, on the one hand, and the contemporary ecological thought on the other, it would be wrong to think that Buddhism is the religion of nature, quote, of nature, one that immediately and inevitably lead to environmental protection activities. In the book I mentioned, Buddhism, Ecology, there is a lot of debate and on this, whether Buddhism is an ecological religion at all. Also, it's equally wrong to think that Christianity by itself is also an ecological religion. There is always a gap between theory and practice, or more concretely, between what believers say and what they do. But this is no argument against the teaching of Buddhism per se. Rather, it calls for a concerted effort by believers of different traditions to draw from their own religious sources on ecological responsibility, to enrich their own insight with those of other religions, and to help each other to live up to their beliefs. And this is one of the tasks of comparative theology. Now I move to the second tradition, Taoist tradition. As I mentioned earlier, the FABC regards harmony and wholeness as characteristic ideals of the Asian way of life. Again, you have to distinguish between the ideal and the practice. Taoism is both a philosophical school, Daojia, and a religious practice, Daojiao, that is distinguished from Confucianism and Buddhism. The classics upon which Taoism is founded are the Tao Te Ching, also known as Lao Shi, and the Xuanxi. The defining concept of Taoist religion is the Tao itself. Literally, it means the way or the path. The Tao referred to the proper course of human conduct, especially as taught by the ancient sages. It soon became to be understood as the metaphysical basis of the natural order itself, primordial yet eternally present. In its primordial state, Tao is described as, quote, nothingness, null and void. But the Tao also manifests itself and becomes present in the sensible world through Qi, literally breath, steam, vapor, or energy. Qi, both as energy and matter, is the basic building which in all things is responsible for movement and energy, and is a vital substance of life. Taoist rituals and religious practices aim at preserving this Qi by combating the forces of aging, illness, and death. The goal at once temporal and spatial is to bring the various parts of the body back into the unified harmony and thus achieve immortality. As with Buddhism, there are certain fundamental insights into humans and the natural world and the basic ethical concept in Taoism that can provide a consistent theoretical framework for ecological ethics. Notable among these are the twin ideas, the set of ideas of De and Dao, virtue and Wei, Wu Wei, non-action, and Ziran, nature. Taken together, these two sets of concepts create an aesthetic order in which no one thing is asserted as better than another. Everything, De, possessing its distinctive significance within the context of Tao of the whole. As Karen L. Lai put it succinctly, and I quote, "The realization of each individual is meaningful only in the context of its relatedness and responsivity to others within the whole Tao. The affirmation of the value of individual beings within the environmental context feeds into the complex holism that emphasizes both the integrity, the interdependence of individuals or things, unquote. A corollary of this ontological aesthetics is a decided rejection of anthropocentrism. So this is a second problem that Pope Francis finds. The first is the technocratic paradigm. The second is the excessive anthropocentrism. And I think Taoism can help us overcome this. Taoist environmentalism opposes any dualism that holds humans as discontinuous with, independent of, superior to, or even opposed to the environment. Instead, Taoism promotes both integrity or individuality, the day, and holism and harmony, the Tao, in defining the individual. It sees the self as self in relation and self in context. In this combined integrity and holism, the whole is not simply the sum of its parts, nor is the whole more than its parts. Rather, the individual cannot be what they are unless they are in harmony with the whole. And the whole cannot be what it is unless it is made up of parts. Again, it is not necessary to delve into all the intricate philosophical and cosmological speculations, the alchemy of Taoism here. Suffice it to note that for our present purpose, that central to Taoism is a religious practice, is the ethics of non-contrivance, Wu Wei. According to Zhuangzi, the Tao acts spontaneously in individual, society, and nature. Similarly, humans must respect and submit to natural changes. In this way, they and the world can become one. By contrast, contrivance should be avoided because it is counterproductive and contrary to the spontaneity of the Tao. The ethics of non-contrivance means that humans must not act against the nature, make use of it, exploit it. Rather, human action, like the Tao's, must be non-purposes, non-deliberative, and yet continuously transforming as natural water flowing downward and fire rising upward. Clearly, such an ethic of non-contrivance and spontaneity run counter to the kind of anthropocentrism that make humans the center or the summit of creation and technological domination of nature the goal of knowledge. Even though Taoist thought and practice are not based on the belief in God the Creator, they provide a powerful stimulus to hear, quote, the cry of nature itself, because everything is connected. And now I come to the last part, the conclusion. What else can we learn and what is left still to be discussed? Obviously, I find the teaching of Pope Francis on ecology is of immense value because it focuses on the religious aspect. It does not neglect the scientific, the political, and economic aspect. That's clear in the encyclical. But what Pope Francis highlights is the religious dimension of this problem, which we need to, and it is this religious dimension that can bring people of faith, of different faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Asian religions, Islam, can come together, in spite of their differences, can find some common ideas on which they can collaborate together. So here, let me list to this. I take it from Irish theologian. The name is Dorr, D-O-R-R. He says that there are 11 areas in which really this has been a really amazing document. First of all, it is a breakthrough. It is an ecology that is based on the Bible. There's a long exposition on the Bible. Second, a comprehensive account of the major environmental issues. So highlight the issues that in ecology. Third, the affirmation of human activities as causing the ecological crisis, the causal connection between human activities and the ecological crisis. Fourth, the strong linkage between the cries of the earth and the cries of the poor. Make them the connection between the cries of the poor and the cries of the earth. Next, he pointed out the danger of the technocratic paradigm. And then he proposed an alternative economy, the economy that respects the nature and creation. The ecological debt of the rich country. This is also another idea. Rich countries that develop so much on the back of the poorer countries. The energies, the oil, and everything that they draw, they just steal from the poorer country. The debt of these rich countries to the poorer countries that they have to pay. And the recognition of the local cooperatives and indigenous communities. This is another idea, the indigenous community. It's so strong in the querida Amazonia, the indigenous, the wisdom of the indigenous people. And I'm so glad that we begin with the acknowledgement of our debt to the indigenous people. And he shows also the ecological practices, recycling. He talks about recycling. Emphasis for need to enforce measures at the national and international level. And finally, the need to pressure the politician to take into account. So I think that this is some of my ideas that I present, and I would love to hear from the respondents that certainly greater expert than me in Buddhism and Taoism. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Phan. Let's just move immediately on to Professor Shiu's response. Henry?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. Are you hearing me? Is my sound okay? Good. Okay. Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Stober and the Fraser Center for inviting me to participate in this dialogue. And thank you, Professor Phan, for your paper on Pope Francis' teaching in dialogue with Asian religions. I'm deeply inspired by your words. Your paper also motivates us to contemplate on the most urgent ecological issues and incorporate into religious doctrine to each of our own religious traditions. While much of Professor Phan's presentation focused on the Laudato Si, Querida Amazonia, and the teachings of the Catholic Church in Asia on ecology, he also gave us an overview of the Buddhist and Taoist perspective on ecology. My brief response today will stem only on the perspective of the Demon. First of all, I would like to say that I cannot agree more with Professor Phan when he said that it would be wrong, quote, to think that Buddhism is a religion of nature, one that immediately and inevitably leads to environmental protection activities, end quote. Indeed, there is a lack of discussion of environmental ethics or conservation of species and plants in these classic texts of Buddhism. I agree, some of these practices could actually raise serious environmental and ecological issues that are antithetical to the intended cultivation of compassion and loving kindness. A clear example is found in the ceremony of animal release, which is one of the most regularly performed rituals in Buddhist practice. The practice involves the freeing of captive animals into the natural habitat, but the institutionalized practice practice of animal release creates the problem of a need to capture the animals to be released during the ceremony. There is also the risk of introducing invasive species associated with animal release, resulting in an unintended negative environmental repercussions. Although the Buddhist faith and practice have always taken on very different forms in different countries over the centuries, what lies at the heart of these Buddhist traditions is first and foremost the quest for attaining life. Buddhists generally do not see humans as having dominion over other animals, but there is the belief that a human rebirth is extremely precious and rare. Rebirth as animals is seen to be unfavorable as a result of bad karma. Of animals are described as a dangerous and dreadful place, viewed with fear and bewilderment. We can understand that these views were incorporated as more or less like a pedagogical tool to encourage the practitioners to make good use of their human rebirth towards enlightenment and not to commit negative karma that will lead to rebirth in the animal realm. But generally speaking, the vast historical and doctrinal complexity of Buddhism make it impossible for us to come up with a distinct, consistent ecological ethic. That we have observed an eco-friendly character of Buddhism in North America is largely due to the fact that Western interest in Buddhism began around 1960s, which coincidentally was around the same time when the environmental movements arose. The links between Buddhist practice and ecological activism were picked up by some of the well-known writers of the time, including Gary Snyder, Allen Ginsberg, and others. They ultimately ignited the sparks of interest in the academic community. Green Buddhism, as some would describe it, can be seen as a way Buddhism adapts itself into North America, which allows not only an unprecedented focus in the discussion of the role Buddhist teachings can play in environmentalism, but more importantly, it also invented a new way of Buddhist practice, one that involves active engagement in environmental protection. While, as we know, the advanced practitioners in Mahayana Buddhism are known as bodhisattvas, some of the practitioners of Buddhist environmentalism in the modern times would call themselves the eco-sattvas. They led to the development of contemporary North American Buddhism to articulate an ecologically effective and spiritually sound Buddhist response to contemporary environmental issues. Indeed, Stephanie Katza, whom Professor Phan has quoted, she observed that, quote, following the footsteps of these visionary thinkers, a number of Buddhist activists organized groups to address specific issues, including nuclear guardianship, factory farming, and forest protection. When these groups work with well-established environmental groups, they seem to be more successful in accomplishing their goals, end quote. So a good example of the environmental group Buddhists have worked with is the Institute for Deep Ecology. Joanna Macy was successful in tying the Buddhist teachings to deep ecology philosophy, advocating a shift towards a wider, more ecological view of the self. Many deep ecologists call their perspective ecocentrism or biocentrism. The philosophy emphasizes that all life forms on Earth have their intrinsic values, that these values are independent of the usefulness for human purposes. It is, of course, of Buddhism. ecologists invite us to identify ourselves with the entirety of the ecosphere and to experience the ecosphere as a great being, dignified and valuable in itself, within which all lives are nodes in a vast web of interconnections, just like the jewel net of Indra. Right? This goes back to the Buddhist teaching of interdependency, especially the simile of the jewel net of Indra, which is frequently mentioned in the Huayan school of Chinese Buddhism, in expressing an ontological model of a holistic philosophy, stressing that all phenomena are mutually penetrating one another. Accordingly, the well-being of the human depends on the birds, the insects, the trees, the clean air, rivers and oceans, and so on. The way Joanna Macy read the close congruence between the Buddhist doctrine of dependent origination and deep ecology philosophy is a direction that modernizes the 2,600 years old Indian religious teaching. It shows us a path leading towards the development of the equal self. The Buddhist notion of liberation from the delusion of self-attachment can therefore converge with the deep ecological philosophy that promises an awakening to the deep experience that all things exist interdependently without any separate self. It sets a great example for Buddhists to work with other groups. The result is not only mutually beneficial, but is also beneficial to the entire ecosphere. As a joint effort to counter what Pope Francis called the technocratic paradigm. I think there are two key points we can take away from these reflections. First, it is a critique of the Western concept of nature as one which places the materialistic interest of humans over animals, plants, and trees. The root of the problem is a polarity we envision between human and nature. As the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh says, quote, "We classify other animals and living beings as nature, acting as if we ourselves are not part of it. Then we pose the question, how should we deal with nature? We should deal with nature the way we should deal with ourselves. We should not harm ourselves. We should not harm nature. Human beings and nature are inseparable," end quote. The second point I want to stress is the need to reformulate these ancient teachings to help us the ecological challenges and to save our planet. Not only Buddhism, the same can be said about Taoism as well. As Professor Phan has explained, the basic idea of Taoism teaches that human life is really only a small part of a larger process of nature. Joseph Needham explained the Tao as, quote, "the order of nature, which brought all things into existence and governs their every action, not so much by force as by a kind of natural curvature in space and time," end quote. The Taoist classic Tao Te Ching suggests that we have the inherent virtue, the cultivation of which can radiate this mysterious influence to everyone and everything with cosmic resonance. That also sounds close to the idea of deep ecology. But then the related Taoist teaching of Wu Wei, or non-action, or non-contrivance, interpreted from a certain angle, may reject the commitment to be involved in any practical actions or activism, rendering the Taoist environmentalism merely a personal spiritual practice or a metaphysical ideal. The Taoist practitioners too may benefit from a well of secular philosophies and knowledge to situate itself in a best position to help everyone live up to the holism and integrity that the Tao Te Ching has inspired them. It is true, as Pope Francis sympathized, that Asia is the continent most vulnerable to ecological degradation. However, we should remind ourselves that the ecological degradation in Asia was not only caused by climate changes or natural disasters. It was also caused by all of us who are living in the West, when we have been dumping plastic waste in Malaysia, sending tons of textile waste into landfills in Bangladesh and Cambodia as a result of our fast fashion, and having Thailand, for example, as a dumping ground for the electronic waste. Education, concerted efforts with other religious traditions, and the inner transformation of all of us are all needed to cope with our ecological crisis. Let me quote a passage written by the Dalai Lama to close my response. The Dalai Lama said that, quote, "We are being drawn together by the grave problems of overpopulation, dwindling natural resources, and an environmental crisis that threaten the very foundation of our existence on this planet. I believe that to meet the challenges of our times, human beings will have to develop a greater sense of universal responsibility. Each of us must learn to work not just for oneself, one's own family, or one's nation, but for the benefit of all humankind. Universal responsibility is the key to human survival," end quote. This, I think, echoes Pope Francis' clarion call for an ecological conversion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shiu. Very thoughtful and careful response. That quite interesting. Peter, you'd be able to respond to that a little bit later, if you like. But let's turn to Michelle for her closing response to Professor Phan's paper. Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you to Dr. Phan and Dr. Shiu for a stimulating conversation, and also to the Fraser Center for inviting me to respond to one of my academic heroes. Climate change and globalization require worldview work. Professor Phan's reading of Pope Francis's major ecological writings from an Asian perspective both intensifies and extends the import of Francis's teaching for contemporary Catholic views of the world. Not only are the daily realities of environmental degradation, such as health threats, natural disasters, and forced migration, acute in the Asian context he describes, but their Christian, Buddhist, and Taoist religious contexts also have worldview wisdom, metaphors for the shape of reality to contribute to the understanding of this state of affairs. When we speak of worldviews, it's important to note that it's absolutely normal to have more than one imaginative map of reality operative at a time. My grandfather worked as a university physicist on the Hubble telescope project, a believer simultaneously in God as creator of the universe and in what the telescope told his team about the origins of the universe. One model might become salient when we need to think through the meaning of our place in the universe, and another model might come to bear when we're deciding between particular medical treatments. So we can play with various maps of reality to see how they help us. Phan shows the Catholic bishops in Asia counteracting a dualistic worldview that pits the natural environment against the life of man, as they say. The bishops right of earth instead as the mother, of whose dust we are made and to whose womb we will return. Or I'm quoting the longer version of the paper. They speak of balance and harmony of and of the universe as an organic whole, a web of relations and chords in a universal symphony. These Catholic teachings are moving toward a non-dual relation between all created beings, which Phan enhances with Buddhist and Taoist insights into reality. For Buddhists, all of reality is interdependent, co-arising in relation to everything else, and each step of the Noble Eightfold Path reflects that insight quite beautifully. Taoists keep in sight a view of the whole to which everyone is related and responsible. Humans are not at the center. These maps of reality are part of the cultural context in which the Asian bishops understand the ecological situation. Worldviews can configure things in space, above, below, within. And a theological worldview evokes the place of God in relation to the world, with language of height and depth, proximity and distance, immanence and transcendence. Working in Canada and the United States, Sally McFagg's model of the earth as the body of God has inspired many in the West with a faithful alternative to the distant or uninvolved deity in earlier Christian monarchical or deistic models. McFagg's metaphor makes room in Christian theology to recognize bodies within the image of God. Hindu traditions, the ones that I work with, similarly gift the world with non-dual worldviews. And so I'd invite us to play for just a moment with the non-dual Shaiva traditions of Kashmir in particular. This tradition is sometimes known as Kashmir Shaivism, though it's moved beyond that region. Utpaladeva, Abhinavagupta, and Kshemaraja are some of its most foremost teachers. Their tradition, just a brief overview, names Shiva as ultimate reality, along with Shakti, the feminine principle that impels his divine consciousness to unfold into creation. It's non-dual because these differentiations in reality that we enjoy as the created world are never separate from their nature as divine consciousness. So I'm sharing just for a moment, a chart that I've created in my research to help visualize this. The non-dual Shaiva tradition holds that when the deity Shiva opens his eyes, creation unfolds into 36 parts. And when he closes his eyes, these parts fold back into pure consciousness. The subtle degrees of this body of consciousness, right there next to the eye on the chart, they gradually differentiate the divine I from the created this. So I and this gradually start to differentiate. And then each set of the parts there are increasingly differentiated from the unity of divine consciousness. Now, each principle arises from the last, and then the last set of parts to emerge in the emanation of creation and also in the human reflection of the divine, I call here the elemental body. The elemental body. So Indian traditions enumerate this set of 10 parts as the gross elements and the subtle elements. There are 5 gross elements: space or ether, air, fire, water, and earth. And those are the fundamental building blocks of the world we experience. The earth principle, which emerges last, is like the densest manifestation of consciousness. So it goes from subtle to dense. And then the subtle elements there, sound, touch, form, taste, and smell, those are less familiar to us, but they form a zone of interaction between The senses, which are next, that engaged body is the group of senses. So the subtle elements are that zone of interaction between the senses and the gross elements. And what I appreciate about this scheme is how the elements are related not only to human and other creatures, but to divinity as well. The Shaiva metaphor of a mirror communicates that the universe and each center of consciousness, so you and me and my dog, all of this each reflects the 36 parts of the body of divine consciousness. In my constructive work in Christian language, I consider, could it be that each of these 36 parts could be part of the image of God in us? So think about it. The elemental body, which is the very antithesis of what many Christians commonly identify as divine, that part that has become the neglected and insensate substrate of human experience, that's part of the Imago Dei. Furthermore, you might notice here, there's that fivefold pattern that that's set up by those 5 elements. It repeats itself in other parts of the body of consciousness. So there's a kind of tunnel of mirrors, an image within an image within an image of the divine. There's a maxim, sarvam sarvamakam. Everything is related to everything else. And that maxim resonates across India's ancient ritual traditions, from the logic of Vedic sacrifice that relies on homologies, bandhus, or links between things so that they work, to the later tantric ritual traditions that map the cosmic principles, all of these things, onto everything else, including the energy centers of the body. So homological reasoning keeps the elemental body operative at all levels of experience and all levels of the cosmos. And the result is that from opposite ends of the spectrum, divine consciousness and the elements are both foundational to everything that exists. All right, so I've been inspired by this worldview to think about how the non-dual structure resonates with the emanation and return scheme that governed Christian Neoplatonist thought from the first few centuries through the Middle Ages. As the theologian known as Pseudo-Dionysius describes it, creation emerges from God and longs to return to God, who is the good beyond being. For both traditions, emanation proceeds from the subtle to the elemental, and spiritual disciplines such as meditation or the sacraments enable the human person to retrace this path and return to the divine source. And ecological Christian theology could repurpose the emanation and return worldview in this shifted form. And it is shifted. A metaphysic of emanation and return has fallen out of favor in the West, in part because of their visual rhetorics that convey value and hierarchy. Both of these emanation patterns actually are usually depicted vertically, with the subtlest parts and God on top and the gross elements way on the bottom. But we can play imaginatively with these inherited worldviews and find new possibilities in comparative study. And that's why the diagram I showed you flips the emanation pattern on its side. It flows side to side rather than high to low, in order to convey a little bit better the liberating crux of the teaching that every dimension of creation shares the nature of divine consciousness. And so everything is also pervaded by divine consciousness, and it dissolves the hierarchy of value. So the positioning of the gross and subtle elements within the body of divine consciousness encourages one to consider the earth, water, air, fire, and space as part of the divine body, as objects of divine attention and regard, and as foundational to everything that exists. I would like to hope that this kind of work, the kind of work that Professor Phan is doing, could make a difference for climate change, groundwater pollution, or any number of ecological concerns. If metaphors like this one and like the ones that the Asian bishops are lifting up could take hold across diverse societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much. Very nice drawing in this very rich Hindu tradition into the discussion. And that's the one thing I think one of the things that has come home to me the most here is the variety of different streams of traditions that have been dialoguing here today is really rich. And we haven't perhaps been able to go into it the depth that we would like, but my goodness, it's very fantastic, quite a mosaic going on here in this context. Now, Professor Phan, would you like to respond to the two speakers before we ask a question or two?
Yeah, it's not to respond to them, but to express my thanks to both Dr. Shiu and Robert about the new insights that they gave me tonight. Now, I make a very important distinction between what the belief and the praxis. Sometimes, most of the time, believers put into practice what they believe. Sometimes they do not. So we should not compare one religion as an ideal and then another religion as practice. This is so unfair, as we Christian theologians have done for a long time. We have to compare ideal with ideals and practice with practice, and then we'll be very, very humble. Both the respondents present to me, as you said, a new map of way, understanding reality. In the 40 minutes, you can do anything much except to raise some of the key issues that for people to think through. And I hope that the students or people who listen can pick up one idea and then deepen it. So my response is to thank both of you for this wonderful response that certainly I don't have the kind of expertise in Buddhism that Henry has or in Hinduism that Michelle has. So thank you so much for this.
Okay, we're pretty much come out of time. we have questions we could ask, and I suppose folks can step out if they need to. But so maybe we could just ask a question or two, and let people disappear if they need to go. One comment came through from Zoom HUC from South Africa, and he kind of echoed Henry's point about Peter's comment about the Asian pollution problem. He mentioned how a lot of he emphasized the contribution of this coming from the west, from the north to the south, or from the west in this context. How in Africa, there's the exporting of large technology pollutants, prior used manufacturing products, the dumping ground for throwaway consumer goods. So that we should really highlight that, I think, in this context, and not just Africa, but also South America and Asia. So this is just wanted to mention that coming from Zoom HUC. I know Henry sort of brought it up. And then one other question that it's a little off track, but it brings us back to the documents that Peter was talking about, the encyclical and then the exhortation. And you talk about the Asian style of presentation that Francis uses, especially in Querda Amazonia, right? Stories, aphorisms, proverbs, poems, dreams, right?
Yes.
And definitely a theo-poetic style coming from the Pope.
Right.
Here. Much different from other past papal documents.
Yes.
And I just wanted to, you want,
Yeah.
but also, Peter, are there limitations to that style?
First of all, I'm so sorry that I don't have the time to talk about this, but this is so fascinating. I have been reading paper encyclical for the last 50 years. And I tell you, if you pick up a document of Pope John Paul II, you could hardly make what he's saying, right? And even Benedict is all citation from Greek philosophers and German philosophers. By the third pages, you just, what the heck is all about, right? So with Pope Francis, that's different. You read at the Querida Amazonia, he talks of 5 dreams he had. Besides, it's so important ecological dream and the human dream. He talked about dreams. I have a dream. When I read it, I just remember of Martin Luther Jr. I have a dream, and Pope Francis talked about. He used it in the first encyclical on the church. I have a dream for the church. And so it really talk to people. People can, and how often, how many poems he cited in Querida Amazonia. And you look at the past, how many, no poems. And I talked about that in my paper, but unfortunately. Now you say, what is the limit of it?
Yeah.
Yes. Ricoeur gave the answer. Symbols gave rise to thought. So when you hear these stories, you start thinking. But if you start with abstract ideas, people just pass that. So symbols give rise to thought. So they are not singing as an opposite, but as mutually enriching each other. Thought becomes very concrete, very attractive, it impelled to practice when it dress up in symbols and poems and dance and music and art. So I don't see them as necessarily opposite in one way, but this is something so new in paper document, the way he writes. And second, never, for the first time, Francis acknowledged that he doesn't have the answer. In Querida Amazonia, he began by saying, oh, you know these things better than I do. This is unbelievable. Acknowledgement of the highest authority in the church, say, you know these things better than I do. I don't have answer to these. And then in the first encyclical on the church, the joy of the gospel, Evangelii Gaudium, he said explicitly, he said, I don't think I have answer to these questions. This is the reverse of the style of magisterium. The magisterium has all the answer to the questions that people never ask.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The way he focuses on indigenous spirituality,
Yes, right?
And its possible significant influence on church teachings.
Yeah, right.
Explicitly, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been happening, but not the degree to which, and he's encouraging it, which is very interesting.
Your article on the indigenous teaching, right? This is the first time you learn from.
Yes. Yeah, we do. It's good. John, go ahead. Do you have a comment, a question? And also, Michelle and Henry, if you have any specific comments for Peter here.
Just a comment, because this was mentioned, interrelationality was mentioned in all of your comments. And in Laudato Si, Francis mentions that everything is interconnected. And some Catholics were uncomfortable with that. And so they went with what he also says, everything is connected.
Mm-hmm.
Like Vince Miller's book, Everything is Connected.
Mm-hmm.
But he actually goes on to say everything is interconnected, which is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder that being in that encyclical, does that now make it doctrine that everything is interconnected, so that it's doctrine in the Catholic Church and it's doctrine in other Asian religions? Just a comment. Feel free to respond if you like.
You know, doctrine take a long time to emerge as doctrine. It's ideas, and this is what I find so interesting in also in Francis, is that it's only through talking to one another that we discover what is true. It's not like I have the truth, a whole truth, and I go to Asia, to Africa, and they say, this is what I want to evangelize you. This is the truth you learn. That time is over. The time is over, no more. It's the questions of, the Asian bishop says, the only mode of evangelization is a dialogue. Dialogue in a humble, I come to learn from you, and you can also maybe learn from me. And the ideas I come and teach you, maybe I have to change it. So the John, you mentioned about doctrine, it would take a while before Francis. And Francis' ideas can get down into the, and you know this, we don't want to go into the politics, church politics. There's a huge group of cardinals and bishops in the United States that simply push back what Francis says. We know that, you know.
Related to that is the stress on Francis's explicit point about the excessive anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
You know, that everyone was speaking towards. Interesting how Henry mentioned even within the Buddhist context, we have that. Probably not so much in Taoism, you know, traditionally, where humanity isn't distinguished from nature in the same way that even in Buddhism you find in that context. But and Peter, you point out how, you know, Francis tries to counter this, drawing on Christian sources, counter but you know, in your paper you don't mention the Christian contributions to this in your paper too much, and I know Michelle was moving in this direction, you know, where she's seemed to be defending, you know, traditional emanation theories, which could be related to that context. But any comments about that, or
Sure. The opposition of church doctrine against emanationism is the pantheism, the threat of pantheistic idea. There is an ontological distinction between God and the world. So this is a concern. But as Michelle says, the emanationism is not simply from top to bottom. It's horizontal. The divine eye is on the same level as the other manifestations. So I think that there is a way of understanding emanationism that is fully orthodox. Okay, so and the second idea is that because in creation is always insisted on ex nihilo.
yes,
Ex nihilo. So there is no emanation at all. It's from nothing. So God created. God is so all powerful as the creation of ex nihilo, out of nothing, no pre-existent matter. Whereas the pantheistic, the emanationism tend to look at, well, there is something that is prior to the emergence of, and that's God. And so you find that in mystical tradition, very strong this idea, that the earth coming out of, but because of this hierarchical, pseudo Dionysius, hierarchical, the angels and so forth, and you are the Neoplatonic background, so the church is very anxious about, hesitant to accept emanationism. It's so emanationism and creation are just seen as opposed. In another context, I would like to talk about creation not as an act of God's power, omnipotence at all. It's the act of weakness that God come out of. So I compare the creation with the act of migration. God migrated from the divine world into the world of other that he creates. And so the migrant doesn't come with power. The migrant come out with our weakness of needs, the danger of being rejected, being killed eventually, you can see. So there is different model of looking at creation as an act of divine weakness, like the kenosis of Jesus, the self-emptying.
Excellent. Well, maybe that's a good point to end on in that context, and to thank everyone, thank the Professor Phan and the panelists, Michelle and Henry, for the effort and the time they put into the project here, and as a very rich discussion, covered a lot of ground, and just for attendees, if you're interested in accessing the recording, if you want to think further about developments here, check the website. We'll be posting it fairly soon, I think. And if you have any questions, if you want to get in contact with Professor Phan, just let us know through the website, and or contact any of us. For that matter, we can put you in touch. Thanks to everyone for coming out. February, we schedule this event in February, typically the Thursday before reading week. And if we continue with Zoom, we won't get snowed out next year, but hopefully we'll be live next year.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping to see everyone again next year. Thanks for coming out in the middle of winter and in the middle of lockdowns. And wish everyone peace and take care.